The spring morning of 1943 arrived cold and gray over the Naval Intelligence Station in Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Margaret Hayes sat hunched over her desk in the cramped radio room, her fingers stained with carbon paper and her eyes burning from another sleepless night. Around her, the clatter of typewriters and the buzz of radio equipment created a constant symphony of war work. Margaret was 28 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair she kept pinned back in the regulation style. She had been working as a code breaker for the Navy since shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. That terrible day had changed everything for her, just as it had for millions of Americans. She had lost her younger brother, Tommy, aboard the USS Arizona. The memory of receiving that telegram still haunted her dreams. "Hayes, coffee," barked Commander Robert Dawson as he strode past her desk without stopping. He did not say please, he never did. Margaret bit back her irritation and rose from her chair. This was the 5th time today Dawson had sent her for coffee, even though there were 3 male junior officers in the room who ranked below her. But pointing this out would only make things worse. She had learned that lesson the hard way during her first week at the station. As she walked to the small kitchen area, she heard the familiar snickering behind her. Lieutenant Junior Grade Bill Morrison, a pudgy man of 30 with a permanent smirk, whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "That's what they're really good for, coffee and typing. Don't know why they bother teaching them the codes." Margaret's hands trembled as she poured the coffee. She wanted to turn around and tell Morrison exactly what she thought of him. She wanted to remind him that she had cracked more Japanese naval codes in the past month than he had in his entire career. But she knew better. Women in the military had to work twice as hard and stay twice as quiet to be taken half as seriously. She delivered the coffee to Commander Dawson's desk. He took it without looking up from his newspaper, without a word of thanks. Margaret returned to her station and pulled out the latest intercepted Japanese transmission. It had come in overnight from one of the listening posts in the Solomon Islands. The message was encrypted in the JN-25 code, the primary cipher used by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Most of the men in the room had glanced at it and dismissed it as routine traffic. But Margaret saw something different. Her trained eye caught unusual patterns in the message structure. There were repeated number sequences that suggested coordinates. There were time stamps, and there was a code designation that made her pulse quicken. AF. AF was the Japanese designation for a high-ranking officer, not just any officer, an admiral or higher. Margaret's mind raced as she began the painstaking work of decryption. She cross-referenced the code groups with previous messages. She consulted her notebooks, filled with months of careful analysis. Slowly, painfully, the message began to reveal its secrets. 2 hours later, Margaret's hands were shaking again, but this time not from anger. This time from excitement and fear. She had broken the message, and what it contained was explosive. The Japanese were planning a frontline inspection tour. A high-ranking officer would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville Island in exactly 1 week. The message included the exact route, the exact timing, and even the type of aircraft. Margaret read through her translation 3 times to be certain. Then she stood and walked to Commander Dawson's office. She knocked on the door frame. "What is it, Hayes?" Dawson asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "Sir, I've decoded an urgent message. It concerns a Japanese inspection tour. I believe it may be someone very important." Dawson sighed heavily, as if she had just interrupted something crucial. "Hayes, we get a dozen of these routine messages every week. File it with the others." "Sir, this one is different. The security protocols are much higher than usual, and the designation code suggests—" "Hayes," Dawson interrupted, finally looking up at her with barely concealed annoyance. "I don't have time for wild theories. You've been working too hard. You're seeing patterns that aren't there. It's what happens when people get too focused on one area." Margaret felt heat rising to her cheeks. She knew exactly what he had almost said. When we let women work on important intelligence. "Sir, I really think you should look at this," she insisted, her voice steady despite her anger. Dawson stood up, his face reddening. "Lieutenant Hayes, I am telling you to file that message with the routine intercepts. That is an order. Now, unless you want to spend the rest of the war filing papers in some basement office in Washington, I suggest you return to your desk." Margaret stood frozen for a moment. Every instinct screamed at her that this message was critical. But Dawson was her commanding officer. Disobeying a direct order could end her career or worse. She saluted stiffly. "Yes, sir." As she turned to leave, she heard Morrison's voice from across the room. "Probably just got confused by all those numbers. Too complicated for the ladies." Laughter rippled through the office. Margaret walked back to her desk with her head high, refusing to let them see how deeply the mockery cut. But as she sat down, she did not file the message away. Instead, she made a copy for herself and tucked it into her notebook. Something in her gut told her this was too important to let go. That evening after her shift ended, Margaret walked along the harbor. The sun was setting, painting the water orange and gold. In the distance, she could see the memorial markers where the Arizona and other ships still rested on the ocean floor. Somewhere down there was Tommy, forever young, forever lost. "I won't let this go," she whispered to the wind. "I promise." Margaret had joined the Navy Code breaking unit for one reason: to strike back at the enemy that had taken her brother. She had endured the dismissals, the mockery, the casual cruelty of men who saw her as little more than a secretary with a uniform. She had proven herself again and again, only to be overlooked and underestimated. But this time felt different. This time she held something in her hands that could change the course of the war. And somehow, someway, she was going to make sure it did not get buried beneath the prejudice and ignorance of men like Commander Dawson. As darkness fell over Pearl Harbor, Margaret made a decision. She would go over Dawson's head. It was risky, perhaps career-ending. But some things mattered more than careers. She thought of Tommy's bright smile, his terrible jokes, the way he had believed she could do anything she set her mind to. "Watch over me, little brother," she said softly. "I'm going to need all the help I can get." The lights of the naval base flickered on across the harbor, and Margaret turned toward home. Tomorrow, she would take the biggest risk of her life. Tomorrow, she would make them listen. Breaking the chain of command. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay in her small apartment near the base, staring at the ceiling, turning over her options. Going over Commander Dawson's head violated every military protocol, but letting this intelligence die on his desk because of his arrogance could cost American lives, could cost the war. By morning, she had made her decision. At 0700 hours, Margaret walked into the intelligence station wearing her dress uniform instead of her usual working khakis. Several of the men noticed and exchanged knowing smirks. They thought she was trying too hard, putting on airs. Let them think what they wanted. Margaret waited until Commander Dawson was in a briefing with Admiral Nimitz's staff. Then she approached Lieutenant Commander James Chen, the station's executive officer. Chen was a quiet man, older than most of the others who had come up through the ranks. He had always been professionally courteous to Margaret, though never particularly warm. "Sir, may I speak with you privately?" Margaret asked. Chen looked up from his work, surprised. "Is this about your assignment, Lieutenant?" "Sir, it's about an intercepted message I decoded yesterday. I believe it requires immediate attention at the highest levels." Chen's expression became guarded. "Have you discussed this with Commander Dawson?" "Yes, sir. He ordered me to file it as routine traffic. But, sir, I respectfully believe his assessment is incorrect." Chen set down his pen slowly. Everyone in the room had suddenly gone quiet. Going behind your commanding officer's back was serious business. "That's a significant allegation, Lieutenant Hayes." "Yes, sir, I understand the implications. But I believe this message indicates that a high-ranking Japanese officer will be conducting an inspection tour next week. The specifics of the intercept suggest someone at the admiral level or higher." Chen studied her face for a long moment. "Come with me." He led her to a small conference room away from the others. Once the door was closed, his demeanor shifted slightly. He was not warm, but he was listening. "Show me what you have," he said. Margaret laid out her work. She showed him the original intercept, her decryption process, and her analysis. She pointed out the unusual security protocols, the specific timing and route information, and most importantly, the designation codes that indicated an officer of extremely high rank. Chen worked through her analysis carefully, asking sharp questions. Unlike Dawson, he actually examined her methodology. He checked her code references. He challenged her assumptions, but fairly, looking for flaws in her logic rather than dismissing it outright. After 40 minutes, Chen sat back and looked at her directly. "Lieutenant Hayes, do you understand what you're suggesting? If you're correct, this could be the most significant intelligence intercept since Midway." But if you're wrong, you've just destroyed your career and possibly mine for insubordination. I understand, sir, but I'm not wrong. Chen studied her face again. How certain are you? Sir, I would stake my career on it. In fact, I am staking my career on it. A slight smile crossed Chen's face, the first she had ever seen from him. Yes, you are, he stood up. Wait here. Chen left the room. Margaret sat alone for 20 minutes, her heart pounding. Through the door, she could hear raised voices. Commander Dawson had returned from his briefing and discovered what she had done. She heard her name shouted, heard words like insubordination and court-martial. Then silence. The door opened and Chen stood there. Come with me, Lieutenant. Admiral Halsey wants to see you. Margaret's stomach dropped. Admiral William Bull Halsey was the commander of the South Pacific Force, one of the most decorated and respected officers in the entire Navy, and she was about to meet him while facing possible charges of insubordination. She followed Chen through the building to the Admiral's temporary offices. Commander Dawson stood in the hallway, his face purple with rage. As Margaret passed, he hissed, "You're finished, Hayes, finished." But Chen kept walking, and Margaret followed. Inside the office, Admiral Halsey sat behind a desk covered with maps and reports. He was a stocky man with graying hair and intense eyes that seemed to look right through a person. Standing next to him was Captain Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, and several other senior staff members. "Lieutenant Hayes," Halsey said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Commander Chen has shown me your analysis. Tell me in your own words what you think you've found." Margaret swallowed hard. This was it. Everything she had worked for came down to this moment. "Sir, I believe the Japanese are planning an inspection tour for one of their highest-ranking naval officers. Based on the routing, the timing, and the security protocols in the message, I believe the officer in question is traveling from Rabaul to Bougainville Island on April 18th. The message specifies the exact flight path and arrival times. And you think this officer is important enough to warrant this briefing because?" Halsey asked. "Sir, the designation codes and security protocols match only one officer in the Japanese Navy. I believe the officer conducting this inspection is Admiral Yamamoto." The room went completely silent. Admiral Yamamoto was not just any Japanese officer. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the man who had planned and executed the strike that killed Tommy and thousands of other American sailors. He was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the strategic genius behind Japan's naval operations. He was, in many ways, the face of the enemy. Captain Layton spoke up. "Lieutenant, that's an extraordinary claim. Yamamoto would never expose himself so predictably." "Sir, that's what makes this intelligence so valuable. According to the message, he's conducting a morale inspection of forward units. It's the kind of visible leadership the Japanese military culture demands, and their codes suggest they believe their ciphers are unbreakable." Halsey leaned forward. "How certain are you of this analysis?" Margaret met his eyes. "Sir, I decoded the message that warned us about Midway last year. My work was instrumental in that intelligence. I stake my professional reputation on this assessment." Halsey exchanged glances with Layton and the other officers. Then he looked back at Margaret. "Lieutenant Hayes, if you're correct, this represents an unprecedented opportunity. We could strike a devastating blow to Japanese morale and military leadership. But mounting such an operation requires absolute certainty. Are you absolutely certain?" Margaret thought of Tommy's face, young and smiling in his uniform. She thought of all the other brothers, sons, fathers who had died at Pearl Harbor and in the battles since. She thought of every snide comment, every dismissal, every time she had been told she was not good enough simply because she was a woman. "Sir, I am absolutely certain." Halsey nodded slowly. Then he turned to his staff. "Gentlemen, prepare operational plans for an interception mission. We're going to kill Admiral Yamamoto." The room erupted into activity. Officers began pulling maps and calling for more intelligence. Halsey turned back to Margaret. "Lieutenant Hayes, you've just triggered one of the most sensitive military operations of the war. If this goes wrong, a lot of people will pay the price. But if you're right," he paused, "if you're right, you'll have struck a blow that will echo through history." "Thank you, sir," Margaret said quietly. As she was dismissed and left the office, she passed Commander Dawson again. His expression had changed from rage to something colder. Fear, perhaps, or the realization that he had badly misjudged the situation. Back at her desk, Margaret sat down with shaking hands. Morrison and the others were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to grudging respect. Word had already spread through the building. Lieutenant Commander Chen appeared at her desk. "Lieutenant Hayes, you've been temporarily reassigned to direct support for Operation Vengeance. Admiral Halsey wants you monitoring all related intelligence personally." "Operation Vengeance, sir." Chen's expression was grim but satisfied. "That's what they're calling it. Seems appropriate, doesn't it?" As Chen walked away, Margaret looked down at her hands. They had stopped shaking. For the first time since Tommy's death, she felt something shift inside her. Not closure, not yet, but purpose. Clear, undeniable purpose. The men who had mocked her, who had dismissed her, who had treated her as nothing more than a coffee-fetching secretary, they were all watching now. They were all waiting to see if she was right. She would not let them down. More importantly, she would not let Tommy down. The war was about to change, and Margaret Hayes had just made it happen. Part 3, the mission takes shape. Over the next 5 days, Pearl Harbor Intelligence Station transformed into the nerve center of Operation Vengeance. Margaret found herself working 18-hour shifts, monitoring every new Japanese transmission, verifying and re-verifying the details of Yamamoto's planned inspection tour. The pressure was immense. Every officer involved in the operation knew what was at stake. If the intercept was genuine and they succeeded, it would be one of the greatest tactical victories of the war. If Margaret's analysis was wrong, resources would be wasted, pilots might die, and America would lose credibility in its intelligence operations. Commander Dawson had been quietly reassigned to administrative duties. Nobody mentioned it directly, but everyone understood. His failure to recognize the importance of Margaret's intercept had nearly cost them the opportunity of a lifetime. Lieutenant Commander Chen had been promoted to acting station commander. On the 3rd day of preparations, Margaret was summoned to a secure briefing room. Inside, she found Admiral Halsey, Captain Layton, and several Army Air Force officers she did not recognize. The most notable was Major John Mitchell, a lean, weathered fighter pilot with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Lieutenant Hayes," Halsey said, gesturing to a chair. "These are the men who will execute the mission. They need to understand exactly what we know and how we know it. Walk them through everything." Margaret stood at the map board and began her briefing. She explained the intercept, the decryption process, and most importantly, the specifics of Yamamoto's planned route. According to the decoded message, Admiral Yamamoto will depart Rabaul at 0600 hours on April 18th, she said, pointing to the map. He'll be flying in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, escorted by 60 fighters. The route takes them along the coast of Bougainville, arriving at their destination at 0945 local time. Major Mitchell studied the map intently. "That's over 400 miles from our base at Henderson Field, at the extreme edge of our range." "Yes, sir," Margaret confirmed, "which is likely why they consider it safe." "What about the timing?" asked another pilot, Captain Thomas Lanphier. "How precise is this intelligence?" "The Japanese military operates on a very strict schedule," Margaret explained. "Admiral Yamamoto is known for his punctuality. If the message says 0600 departure, he will depart at 0600. If it says 0945 arrival, he will arrive at 0945. "You're betting our lives on Japanese punctuality," Lanphier said, not unkindly but with appropriate skepticism. Margaret met his eyes. "Sir, I'm betting my career and reputation on the accuracy of this intelligence. I would not have brought this forward if I had any doubt." Mitchell turned to Halsey. "Admiral, we'll need P-38 Lightnings. They're the only fighters with the range to make this intercept. And we'll need extra fuel tanks, which means we'll be flying heavy and vulnerable if we encounter enemy fighters before reaching the intercept point." "You'll have 18 P-38s, Halsey said. "The best pilots we have. This mission is designated top priority." Over the next hour, they planned the details. Margaret provided every piece of intelligence she had, weather patterns, typical Japanese patrol routes, communication protocols. The pilots asked hundreds of questions, probing for any weakness in the analysis. At one point, Captain Lanphier asked, "Lieutenant, why are you so certain this is Yamamoto himself? Could it be another admiral?" Margaret had prepared for this question. "Sir, I've been tracking Japanese naval communications for 18 months. I know their patterns, their designations, their protocols. The level of security surrounding this particular message is unprecedented. The specific call signs and routing codes match only one individual in their entire command structure. It's him. When the briefing ended, Mitchell approached Margaret. "Lieutenant Hayes, I want you to know something. Those boys and I were putting our lives in your hands. We trust the intelligence. We trust you." Margaret felt the weight of those words. "I won't let you down, sir." Mitchell studied her face for a moment. "I heard what happened with your brother at Pearl Harbor. I'm sorry." "Thank you, sir." "Is that why you do this work?" Margaret considered the question. "Partly, sir, but mostly I do it because I'm good at it, and right now that matters more than anything else." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Yes, it does," he extended his hand. "Good hunting, Lieutenant." They shook hands, and Margaret felt something shift. These men were not like Morrison or Dawson. They did not care that she was a woman. They cared that she was good at her job. They cared that her intelligence might bring them home alive. The next 2 days passed in a blur of final preparations. Margaret continued monitoring Japanese communications for any hint that the mission had been compromised, any suggestion that Yamamoto had changed his plans. Nothing changed. The Japanese continued their routine traffic, completely unaware that their most secure codes had been broken. On the evening of April 17th, Margaret stood outside the intelligence station, watching the sun set over the Pacific. Tomorrow, American pilots would take off before dawn. They would fly hundreds of miles across enemy territory, and if her analysis was correct, they would intercept and kill Admiral Yamamoto. She thought about all the people who had doubted her. Commander Dawson, who had dismissed her work as female hysteria. Morrison, who had mocked her intelligence. All the casual cruelties and dismissals she had endured. But she also thought about Lieutenant Commander Chen, who had listened. About Admiral Halsey, who had trusted her judgment. About Major Mitchell and his pilots, who were willing to risk their lives based on her word. The door opened behind her, and Chen stepped out. "Big day tomorrow," he said quietly. "Yes, sir." "How are you holding up?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "Terrified, sir. What if I'm wrong? What if I've sent those men to their deaths for nothing?" Chen was quiet for a moment. "Lieutenant, in intelligence work we never have perfect certainty. We make the best assessments we can with the information available. You've done that. Your analysis is sound. Now we trust the pilots to do their job. And if something goes wrong, then we learn from it and move forward. But Hayes, I've reviewed your work. It's solid, more than solid. It's some of the best intelligence analysis I've seen in my entire career." He paused. "And I've been doing this since before you were born." Margaret smiled despite her anxiety. "Thank you, sir." "Get some rest," Chen said. "Tomorrow we make history." But Margaret could not rest. She returned to her apartment but could not sleep. She paced, she reviewed her notes for the 100th time, she prayed. Mostly she thought about Tommy and about all the men who would fly tomorrow morning into the unknown. At 0400 hours, Margaret gave up on sleep and returned to the station. She was not the only one. The entire intelligence staff was already there, monitoring communications, waiting. At 0530, word came through that the P-38s had taken off from Henderson Field. 18 fighters, flying low to avoid radar, carrying extra fuel tanks that would be jettisoned before combat. Now came the waiting, the hardest part. Margaret sat at her station, headphones on, listening to the crackle of radio traffic. Japanese communications, American updates, the background noise of war. At 0800 hours, a new message came through the Japanese network. Routine traffic. Yamamoto's bomber had departed Rabaul on schedule. Margaret's heart began to pound. It was happening. Everything she had predicted was coming true. At 0930, the room fell completely silent. Everyone was listening, waiting for the next message. At 0943, American radio traffic exploded with urgent calls. Target spotted, 2 bombers, 6 fighters. Engaging now. Break left, break left. The sound of combat filled the airwaves. Voices shouting coordinates, warnings, confirmations. The chatter of machine guns could be heard in the background of some transmissions. Margaret sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her desk, listening to men fight and die 400 miles away. Then, cutting through the chaos, a calm voice. Splash 1 bomber. Repeat, Splash 1 bomber, target is down. The room erupted. Officers were shouting, celebrating. Someone was pounding on a desk in triumph. But Margaret sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face. They had done it. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was dead. And she had made it happen. Part 4, The Way to Victory. The confirmation came in pieces over the next several hours. The Japanese themselves, through their increasingly frantic and unencoded communications, revealed the truth. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had been killed in action when American fighters shot down his bomber over Bougainville. Pearl Harbor intelligence stations celebrated throughout the day. Officers shook hands, slapped backs, and spoke in excited tones about the strategic implications. The Japanese would be demoralized. Their leadership was decapitated. This was revenge for Pearl Harbor, for the Arizona, for all the battles lost in those first dark months of the war. But Margaret felt strangely hollow. She had accomplished what she set out to do. She had struck back at the enemy who killed her brother. She had proven her worth to everyone who had doubted her. By all measures, this should have been the greatest day of her life. Instead, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. Admiral Halsey called her to his office late that afternoon. When she entered, he stood and offered his hand. Lieutenant Hayes, on behalf of the United States Navy and the nation, thank you. Your intelligence work made this victory possible. Thank you, sir, Margaret said quietly. Halsey studied her face. You don't seem as pleased as I expected. Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Sir, I am grateful that the mission succeeded. I'm grateful our pilots returned safely. I'm grateful for what this means strategically. But you're thinking about the man who died, Halsey finished. Yes, sir, is that wrong? Halsey sat down and gestured for her to do the same. Lieutenant, I've been in this Navy for 30 years. I've sent men into battle. I've watched ships sink. I've signed orders that I knew would result in deaths on both sides, and every single time I think about the cost. He leaned forward. Yamamoto was a brilliant strategist and by all accounts a man of honor. In another life, in another time, I might have respected him as a fellow naval officer. But he attacked Pearl Harbor. He killed thousands of our men, and he would have continued killing Americans until we were defeated or until we killed him first. That's the nature of war, Lieutenant. It's not clean, it's not simple, and it never feels the way you think it will. How do you live with it, sir? By remembering why we're fighting, Halsey said. We didn't start this war, we didn't attack first. Every action we take is in defense of our country and our way of life. Yamamoto made his choices, we made ours, and today our choices prevailed. Margaret nodded slowly. My brother Tommy, sir, he was 19. He wanted to see the world, meet people from different places. That's why he joined the Navy, and he died without ever getting that chance. I'm sorry, Halsey said simply. For a long time I wanted revenge. I wanted to hurt them the way they hurt us. And now I have, and it doesn't bring Tommy back. It doesn't heal anything. No, Halsey agreed. But it might save the next Tommy, the next 19-year-old boy who just wants to see the world. That's what you did today, Lieutenant. You didn't just take revenge. You saved lives. Those words stayed with Margaret as she left the Admiral's office and returned to her station. Over the next several days, the implications of Yamamoto's death rippled through the Pacific Theater. Japanese morale plummeted. American morale soared. Intelligence intercepts showed confusion and disarray in the Japanese command structure as they struggled to replace their most capable leader. But something else happened too, something Margaret had not anticipated. The story of the intercept leaked. It started as rumors, then came the whispers, and finally reporters began sniffing around, trying to piece together how America had managed to intercept and kill Yamamoto with such precision. The Navy clamped down hard on information, but damage was done. If the Japanese discovered that their codes had been broken, they would change their entire communication system. Years of intelligence work would be lost. Margaret was called into a meeting with Lieutenant Commander Chen and several security officers. Lieutenant Hayes, one of the security officers said, we need to understand exactly who knew about your analysis and when. Sir, I briefed Commander Dawson first, then Lieutenant Commander Chen, then Admiral Halsey and his staff. And did you discuss it with anyone else? Any colleagues, friends, family? No, sir, I understood the classified nature of the information. The security officer made notes. We believe the leak came from someone in the operational chain, but we're interviewing everyone involved. After the security officers left, Chen spoke quietly. Margaret, there's something you should know. Commander Dawson has been talking to reporters. Margaret's stomach dropped. What? He's claiming that he was the one who recognized the importance of your intercept, that he personally briefed Admiral Halsey. He's trying to take credit for the operation. Rage flared hot in Margaret's chest. That's a lie. He ordered me to file it away. He dismissed my analysis entirely. I know, Chen said. Admiral Halsey knows. Everyone who was actually there knows. But Dawson is talking to the press and he's a commander. You're a lieutenant. The Navy brass is concerned about public perception. So they're going to let him steal credit for my work. Chen's expression was pained. Margaret, the bigger concern right now is protecting the source of the intelligence. The Navy doesn't want to publicize that we broke Japanese codes. They certainly don't want to publicize that a female code breaker was responsible. It raises too many questions. So I'm supposed to stay quiet while Dawson lies. For now, yes, for the good of the war effort. Margaret stood up, her chair scraping loudly. With respect, sir, that's not fair. No, Chen agreed. It's not, but war rarely is. Over the next week, Margaret watched as Commander Dawson gave interviews to military newspapers. She read articles that credited him with brilliant analysis and strategic thinking. She listened as other officers congratulated him on his role in Operation Vengeance. Morrison, who had mocked her so cruelly, now acted as if he had been part of the triumph. Dawson's really something, he told anyone who would listen. Knew immediately that message was important. That's the kind of leadership we need. Margaret said nothing. She followed orders. She continued her work, breaking codes, analyzing intelligence, contributing to the war effort in silence. But inside, something was breaking. One evening, she walked alone along the harbor again. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The memorial markers rose from the water, silent witnesses to sacrifice and loss. I did it, Tommy, she whispered. I got him. I got the man who planned the attack, but nobody knows. Nobody will ever know. A voice behind her said, I know. Margaret turned. Major Mitchell stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. He had just returned from the Solomon Islands, back for reassignment. Sir, Margaret said, straightening. At ease, Lieutenant. Mitchell walked up to stand beside her, looking out at the harbor. I read the newspaper articles, saw Commander Dawson's interviews. That must be hard. Margaret said nothing. I was there in the briefing room, Mitchell continued. I know who did the real work, so do my pilots, so does Admiral Halsey. That counts for something. Does it, sir? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like the truth doesn't matter. Only the story matters. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. You're right, and that's not fair. But Hayes, I want you to know something. Those boys I flew with were alive because of you. We succeeded because of you. We struck a blow against the enemy because of you. History might not remember your name, the newspapers might not tell your story, but we remember, and we're grateful. Tears stung Margaret's eyes. Thank you, sir. Don't give up, Mitchell said. The war isn't over. Your work isn't done. Keep fighting, Lieutenant, in your own way, on your own battlefield. That's all any of us can do. He saluted her, a gesture of respect between equals, and walked away. Margaret stood alone as darkness fell, thinking about everything that had happened. About Tommy and Yamamoto, about justice and revenge, about truth and lies. And slowly, very slowly, she began to understand something. The war she was fighting was not just against the Japanese. It was against ignorance and prejudice, against men like Dawson who stole credit, against men like Morrison who thought women were good for nothing but coffee and typing. That war would not end when Japan surrendered. That war would continue for years, maybe decades. But she would keep fighting it. For Tommy, for herself, for all the women who would come after her. The battle for recognition had just begun, the truth that couldn't stay buried. 6 months after Operation Vengeance, Margaret was still working in Pearl Harbor, still breaking codes, still being overlooked. Commander Dawson had been promoted to captain and transferred to Washington, where he continued to build his reputation as a brilliant intelligence officer. The truth about Margaret's role remained buried under classified documents and Navy politics. But war has a way of revealing secrets. In October 1943, Margaret was working late when Lieutenant Commander Chen called her into his office. His expression was serious. Margaret closed the door. She did, feeling a knot form in her stomach. "Sir, I'm being transferred to Washington. I'm going to be working directly with Admiral King's staff." "Congratulations, sir." Chen shook his head. "That's not why I called you in. I want you to come with me. I'm requesting you as my primary analyst." Margaret sat down slowly. "Sir, are you certain?" "Margaret, you're the best code breaker in the Pacific Fleet, probably the best in the entire Navy. You should have been promoted twice by now. You should have received a commendation for Operation Vengeance. Instead, you've been stuck at Pearl Harbor while men with half your talent move up the ranks." He paused. "That needs to change." "The Navy will never approve it," Margaret said. "They don't want women in positions of real authority." "The Navy is changing, whether it wants to or not. We need people with your skills, and I've got enough friends in Washington to make this happen." Hope stirred in Margaret's chest, dangerous and fragile. "What would I be doing?" "Coordinating intelligence analysis for the entire Pacific Theater, briefing admirals and generals, making strategic recommendations." Chen smiled. "Making the people who matter listen to you." "When would I leave?" 2 weeks. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about the offer. It was everything she had wanted: recognition, authority, the chance to truly impact the war effort. But she also knew what it would mean: more enemies, more men who would resent her success, more battles fought in conference rooms instead of on the ocean. She thought about Tommy, about what he would say. "Go get 'em, sis," she could almost hear him say. "Show them what you're made of." 2 weeks later, Margaret arrived in Washington, D.C. The city was transformed by war. Buildings converted to military offices, uniforms everywhere, an electric sense of purpose in the air. Chen's new office was in the Navy Department building. Margaret's desk was right outside, positioned as his executive officer for intelligence analysis. The promotion to lieutenant commander had come through, along with orders signed by Admiral King himself. On her first day, Chen introduced her to the senior staff. Most were professional, if reserved. A few were openly skeptical, and one was openly hostile. "Captain Robert Dawson." He stood in the back of the conference room during Margaret's introduction, his face darkening as he realized who she was. After the meeting, Dawson cornered her in the hallway. "Hayes," he said coldly, "I see you've managed to charm your way into another position above your abilities." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I see you've managed to lie your way into another promotion." Dawson's face reddened. "Watch yourself, Lieutenant Commander. You may have friends protecting you now, but that can change very quickly." "Is that a threat, sir?" "It's a warning. Some truths are better left buried." He walked away, leaving Margaret shaken but determined. Over the next 3 months, Margaret proved herself in Washington just as she had in Pearl Harbor. Her analyses were sharp. Her briefings were clear. Slowly, grudgingly, the senior officers began to respect her. But Dawson was always there, undermining her, spreading rumors, taking credit where he could. The breaking point came in January 1944. Margaret was briefing Admiral King on Japanese naval movements in the Philippine Sea. Dawson was also in the room, having inserted himself into the meeting at the last minute. As Margaret explained her analysis, Dawson interrupted. "Sir, I believe the lieutenant commander is misreading these intercepts. The Japanese are actually moving their fleet north, not south." Margaret kept her voice level. "Sir, with respect to Captain Dawson, the intercepts clearly indicate—" "I've been doing this work since before you joined the Navy, Hayes," Dawson snapped. "I think I know how to read Japanese naval codes." Admiral King held up a hand. "Captain Dawson, what's your evidence?" Dawson laid out an alternative interpretation. It was plausible but relied on several assumptions that Margaret knew were incorrect based on her months of tracking Japanese communication patterns. "Sir," Margaret said carefully, "Captain Dawson's interpretation doesn't account for the recent changes in Japanese code protocols. Over the past 3 months, they've shifted their designation systems. I've been tracking these changes." "Oh, for God's sake," Dawson exploded. "This is exactly what happens when we put people in positions they're not qualified for. Sir, I apologize, but I have to speak plainly. Lieutenant Commander Hayes is in over her head." The room went silent. Admiral King's expression was unreadable. "Captain Dawson, what exactly are you suggesting?" "Sir, I'm suggesting that this position requires someone with extensive experience and proven judgment. Lieutenant Commander Hayes has neither." Margaret felt her face burning. This was it, the moment where everything she had worked for would either be validated or destroyed. Admiral King turned to her. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes, how certain are you of your analysis?" Margaret took a breath. She thought about all the times she had been dismissed, doubted, mocked. She thought about Tommy. She thought about the pilots who had trusted her intelligence about Yamamoto. "Sir, I am absolutely certain, and I can prove it." She pulled out a folder she had prepared, knowing this confrontation was coming eventually. Inside were months of communication intercepts, pattern analyses, and most importantly, a detailed breakdown of how she had decoded the message about Yamamoto's inspection tour. "Sir, Captain Dawson claims extensive experience and proven judgment, but when I brought him the Yamamoto intercept last April, he ordered me to file it as routine traffic. He dismissed my analysis entirely. If Lieutenant Commander Chen had not overruled him, Admiral Yamamoto would still be alive." Dawson's face went white. "That's a lie. I was the one who recognized the importance of that intercept." "No, sir, you were not." Margaret's voice was steady, cold. "And I have documented proof." She handed Admiral King copies of her original notes, Chen's memorandums, and the timeline of events. Everything that showed Dawson had tried to bury the most important intelligence intercept of the war. Admiral King read through the documents in silence. When he looked up, his expression was thunderous. "Captain Dawson, is this true? Did you order Lieutenant Commander Hayes to dismiss this intelligence?" Dawson's mouth opened and closed. "Sir, the situation was more complicated than." "Did you or did you not dismiss her analysis?" "Sir, at the time it seemed like routine traffic. I was being cautious. There was no way to know." "No way except for listening to the officer who had actually decoded the message." Admiral King stood up. "Captain Dawson, get out of my office. You're relieved of your current duties pending an investigation." "Sir, you can't." "I can and I am. Get out." Dawson shot Margaret a look of pure hatred and left the room. Admiral King turned to Margaret. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes, I owe you an apology. The Navy owes you an apology. Your analysis regarding Operation Vengeance was exemplary. Your work since then has been outstanding, and you've been denied the recognition you deserve." "Thank you, sir," Margaret said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. I'm about to make your life much harder." King smiled slightly. "I'm promoting you to commander and putting you in charge of the entire Japanese Naval Intelligence Section. You'll be briefing the Joint Chiefs directly. You'll be coordinating with Army and British intelligence, and you'll be doing the job that Captain Dawson just lost." Margaret felt dizzy. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept." "I accept, sir." As she left Admiral King's office, Margaret walked through the building in a daze. Other officers looked at her with new respect or new resentment. She had just become one of the highest-ranking women in Navy intelligence. Lieutenant Commander Chen met her in the hallway. He was grinning. "I told you things were changing," he said. "You knew this was going to happen." "I had hopes, and I had documentation, just in case someone needed to be reminded of the truth." He put out his hand. "Congratulations, Commander Hayes." That evening, Margaret returned to her small apartment and finally let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. She had won. Not just the battle, but the war, at least her personal war. She picked up the photograph of Tommy she kept on her desk. He smiled back at her, forever 19, forever hopeful. "We got him, Tommy," she whispered. "And now they know, now they all know." But as she sat in the quiet room, Margaret realized something important. This was not just about her anymore. This was about every woman who would serve in the military after the war ended. Every woman who would fight for recognition, for respect, for the simple right to be judged on their abilities rather than their gender. She had opened a door. Now she had to make sure it stayed open. The war in Europe was reaching its climax. The war in the Pacific would continue for more than a year. But Margaret's personal war, the one fought in offices and briefing rooms against prejudice and small-minded men, that war had just scored a major victory. 3 months later, on a warm April morning exactly 1 year after Operation Vengeance, Margaret stood in Admiral King's office, receiving the Navy Commendation Medal for her role in the Yamamoto intercept. The citation specifically mentioned her code-breaking work and strategic analysis. It was a small ceremony, attended only by senior officers. The details were still classified. The public would not learn the full story for decades. But as Margaret stood at attention, accepting the medal, she glanced at the men around her. Admiral King, Lieutenant Commander Chen, the other senior officers who had finally recognized her worth. And she saw respect in their eyes. Real respect. The kind that could not be stolen or dismissed or denied. After the ceremony, Margaret walked outside into the spring sunshine. Washington was beautiful this time of year, the cherry blossoms in full bloom along the Potomac. She thought about how far she had come, from a grieving sister seeking revenge to a code breaker dismissed and mocked, to one of the most powerful intelligence officers in the Navy. The path had not been easy, the battles had not been fair, but she had persevered. And in the end, the truth had won. Margaret looked up at the clear blue sky and smiled. "Did you see that, Tommy?" she whispered. "We did it, we really did it." Somewhere, she liked to think, her little brother was smiling too. The war was not over. There would be more battles, more sacrifices, more long nights breaking codes and analyzing intelligence. But Margaret Hayes faced the future with confidence. She had proven that courage comes in many forms, that heroism is not just about flying fighter planes or commanding ships, that sometimes the greatest victories are won by people who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to be dismissed, who refuse to give up even when everything and everyone tells them they should. The Japanese had been stunned when American pilots killed Admiral Yamamoto. But the real story, the one that would echo through the decades, was that a woman they never knew existed had made it all possible. And now, finally, her own people knew it too.